Hey everyone, Jackson here. Welcome back to the channel. What happens if you take a tomato slice out of a McDonald's burger, plant it in soil, and actually try to grow a real tomato plant from it? Not seeds from a garden store, not heirloom seeds from a packet, not a seedling from a nursery. I'm talking about a tomato slice from a fast food burger. Because think about that for a second. That tomato was picked, processed, packed, shipped, sliced, stacked into a burger, handed across a counter, and eaten as part of one of the most mass-produced meals on Earth. So the question is, after all of that, is there still enough life left inside those seeds to grow a healthy tomato plant? And if it does grow, what kind of tomato would it become? Would it be weak? Would it be deformed? Would it make tiny fruit? Would it make no fruit at all? Or could something surprisingly amazing come out of something so ordinary and so unexpected? That is exactly what we're going to find out, because today's experiment is one of those gardening ideas that sounds ridiculous at first. But the more you think about it, the more fascinating it becomes. A burger is supposed to be the end of the line. It's supposed to be the final product. You buy it, you eat it, and that's it. But hidden inside that burger tomato are seeds. And hidden inside those seeds is potential. That means even in something as processed, commercial, and forgettable as fast food, life can still be waiting. And honestly, that is what makes this experiment so interesting to me. Because this is not just about seeing whether a silly internet idea works. This is about testing whether a tiny part of something artificial and disposable can be turned back into something real, living, productive, and valuable. Can a slice of tomato from a McDonald's burger become an actual food-producing plant? Can it survive? Can it thrive? Can it fruit? And maybe the biggest question of all, would those tomatoes actually taste good? Today, we're going to plant it, grow it, track it, harvest it, and taste it. But by the end of this video, we're going to know whether this is just a fun gimmick or one of the craziest gardening experiments you can actually pull off at home. So let's do it. The first step was obvious. I had to go get the burger. Now, if you're going to try something like this, you need a burger that actually comes with tomato slices on it. So I got one with fresh tomato inside, opened it up, and carefully pulled the tomato slices out. And right away, this became more interesting than I expected, because once I started looking closely at the tomato slice, I could clearly see seeds inside it. Real seeds, not dead-looking, flattened trash. Real, mature-looking seeds that still had structure to them. That was the first moment where I thought, hold on, this might actually work. Now, I didn't want to leave too much to chance, so I decided to approach this experiment in a way that would give it the best odds possible. Instead of only trying one method, I wanted multiple angles. I wanted to know not just whether one lucky seed could sprout, but whether the tomato slice itself still held enough viable life to give me repeatable results. So I used two different approaches. For the first method, I carefully pulled individual seeds from the burger tomato slice by hand. Then I cleaned them off gently, because tomato seeds are usually surrounded by a slippery coating that can interfere with germination if you don't remove it. I rubbed that coating away so the seeds had a cleaner start. For the second method, I decided to do something even simpler, and honestly a little more chaotic. I took part of the tomato slice itself and planted the slice directly into the soil. That way, I wasn't just testing cleaned seeds. I was also testing whether the slice, more or less as is, could break down naturally and allow seeds to sprout on their own. Two methods. One burger tomato. One strange experiment. And now it was time to plant. I grabbed a couple of containers, made sure they had proper drainage, and filled them with a light, moist seed-starting mix. I wanted the soil damp, but not soaking wet. Seeds need moisture to wake up, but they also need oxygen. Too much water and they can rot before they ever get the chance to grow. That's one of the reasons so many people fail with seed starting. They think more water means more life. But with seeds, balance matters. Once the soil was ready, I planted the cleaned seeds shallowly into one container and buried the slice method into the other. Nothing fancy, just simple, clean setup, good moisture, and a warm place to germinate. Then I waited. And this is where every gardening experiment becomes psychological. Because at first, nothing happens. The soil just sits there looking the same. You check it, you stare at it. You wonder if you're wasting your time. You wonder if those seeds are dead. You wonder if fast food processing somehow ruined them. You wonder if the whole idea was just too dumb to work. But if you garden long enough, you learn that invisible progress is still progress. Seeds do their best work where you cannot see it. Before anything green appears above the soil, a decision has to be made below it. The seed has to absorb water. Its shell has to soften. Its internal biology has to wake up. The root has to emerge first, and only then does the stem begin moving upward toward the light. That is one of the most beautiful things in gardening. Life begins in silence. A few days passed. Then one morning, I checked the containers again, and there they were, sprouts, tiny little tomato seedlings pushing their way up out of the soil. And not just one, multiple seedlings had emerged. At that moment, the answer to the first big question was clear. Yes, tomato seeds from a McDonald's burger can still sprout. That alone was wild. Something pulled from a fast food sandwich had just proven itself alive. And honestly, that moment felt bigger than it should have. Because when you look at a burger, you don't think about possibility. You think about convenience. You think about speed. You think about something temporary. But here in front of me was proof that even after being packaged into one of the most commercial food systems imaginable, those tomato seeds had not given up their ability to grow. That is incredible. As the days went on, the seedlings developed more strength. Their first baby leaves were followed by true leaves, and once that happened, I knew the experiment had entered the serious stage. Sprouting is exciting, but it is only the beginning. A lot of seedlings sprout, far fewer become healthy plants, and even fewer go on to produce food. So from this point forward, this was no longer a germination experiment. Now it was a growing trial. I thinned the seedlings down, choosing the strongest looking plants. This part always feels a little brutal, but it matters. If you leave too many seedlings crowded together, they compete for light, nutrients, water, and root space. Strong growth requires room. The healthiest plant from the clean seed method stayed. The strongest one from the slice-planted method stayed too. Now the real contest could begin. 2 tomato plants from one burger source, each heading into the next stage of life. As the seedlings continued to grow, they started showing me their personality. They didn't look weak. They didn't look sickly. They didn't look confused about being born from a burger. They looked like tomato plants. That may sound simple, but it mattered, because it told me that these seeds were not just surviving, they were functioning normally. They were doing what tomato genetics are designed to do: wake up, root in, reach upward, and grow. And once they reached a strong enough size, it was time to transplant them. Now I wanted this experiment to be fair, but I also wanted it to be revealing. So instead of growing both plants the exact same way, I decided to test them in 2 common home garden scenarios. One plant would go into the ground, the other would go into a container. That way, we could learn 2 things at once. First, whether burger tomato seeds can produce real plants. And second, how those plants perform under different growing conditions. The ground-grown tomato got planted into a prepared space with healthy soil, decent depth, and room to spread out. I buried it deeply, because tomatoes are one of those plants that can form additional roots along the buried stem. That makes them stronger and more stable over time. The container-grown tomato went into a pot with drainage holes, quality soil, and enough space to establish itself, though obviously not as much room as a plant in the ground. Right away, I knew this would be an interesting comparison, because tomatoes can be incredibly productive in containers, if you stay on top of watering and feeding. But if you miss that rhythm, container tomatoes can punish you fast. In-ground plants usually have more forgiveness. Their root zone stays cooler, moisture is more stable, and they're less dependent on you getting everything right every single day. Still, both setups had a real shot, and now it was time for the long middle part of the experiment, the part that separates fun ideas from meaningful results. Week by week, I kept checking in. The plants grew, the leaves expanded, the stems thickened. And little by little, the experiment stopped looking like a joke. It started looking like a legitimate tomato grow. That was one of my favorite parts of this whole process, the transformation, because it's one thing to say, I planted seeds from a McDonald's burger. It's another thing entirely to look at a healthy green tomato plant and realize, this actually came from that burger. That contrast never stopped being satisfying. Fast food on one end, a living garden plant on the other. And standing between them was time, soil, and care. That's powerful. As the plants got bigger, one thing became very clear. The in-ground tomato was absolutely loving life. It had stronger momentum, deeper color, more balanced growth, and a generally more vigorous appearance. It looked comfortable, it looked established, it looked like it intended to do something serious. The container plant also grew well, especially early on, but it was always a little more dependent on me being precise. It had less margin for error. That difference became even more obvious once summer pressure started kicking in. Heat changes everything. A tomato in the ground can often push through hot weather more gracefully because its roots have access to a larger soil volume and more stable moisture. But a tomato in a container is living in a small artificial environment. That soil heats up faster, dries out faster, and can swing from ideal to stressful in no time. And sure enough, that challenge started to show. The container tomato still looked productive, still looked promising, but it began showing signs that it would require much more careful management if it was going to match the performance of the one in the ground. Meanwhile, the plant in the ground just kept charging forward. Then came one of the most exciting moments in the life of any fruiting plant: flowers. Once I saw those first blooms forming, the experiment changed again, because now we were no longer asking whether a burger tomato could sprout. We were no longer asking whether it could become a healthy plant. Now we were asking the question everyone really cares about. Can this thing actually make tomatoes? And when those flowers opened, that question suddenly felt very real. Tomato flowers are humble, but to gardeners, they carry enormous promise. Each flower is a chance. Each flower is potential food. Each flower is the bridge between growth and harvest. And once pollination does its job, the flower gives way to swelling fruit. That is when gardening stops being theoretical. That is when it becomes tangible. As the flowering increased, both plants began setting fruit. But the in-ground plant was clearly winning. It was fuller, heavier, more confident, and setting more tomatoes. And the wildest part? This plant wasn't just making a few token fruits to prove the experiment technically worked. It was loading up. I'm talking real clusters, real production. The kind of production that makes you stop and stare. At that point, I started asking a different question. Not will this work, but how far can this actually go? Because the answer was becoming obvious. Way farther than most people would expect. Now, not everything was perfect. This is the part where gardening humbles every experiment. A few disease issues showed up on some lower leaves. Nothing unusual for tomatoes, especially in warm weather with moisture and airflow challenges. So I removed affected leaves carefully and stayed on top of sanitation. That's part of the game. Tomatoes are generous plants, but they are not maintenance-free. The bigger issue, though, came with the container-grown plant. In periods of intense heat, I wasn't perfectly consistent with watering, and container tomatoes do not forgive that easily. The result was stress. Some blossoms dropped, some fruit quality suffered, and a few tomatoes developed problems related to uneven watering. That was an important lesson. The experiment itself proved burger tomato seeds can grow. But it also reminded me that once the seed becomes a real tomato plant, the rules are no longer weird or magical. It still needs the same fundamentals every tomato needs: sunlight, consistent moisture, nutrition, support, airflow, attention. A novelty origin does not erase normal plant biology. And honestly, I like that, because it means nature is still in charge. You can start a tomato from an unusual place, but once it's alive, it still asks for real care. That's fair. As the season moved on, the in-ground plant became the star of the show. The fruit kept swelling, the branches got heavier, the support structure had to do real work. And this is where anticipation started building hard, because tomato experiments are fun early, but the emotional payoff lives in the ripening. Green fruit is a promise, red fruit is the answer. Once the first signs of color finally appeared, I knew we were entering the final chapter. And that feeling never gets old. No matter how many times you grow tomatoes, the first blush of ripening still feels like a reward. It's the plant saying, everything up to this point was worth it. The in-ground plant by now had become almost unbelievable in its productivity. There were clusters everywhere, fruit hanging low, branches carrying more than I ever would have expected from seeds pulled out of a burger slice. If I had shown someone the mature plant without context, they never would have guessed where it came from. They would have assumed it came from a seed packet, a nursery start, or some reliable garden source. But no, this thing started in fast food. That alone made every update exciting. Then finally, it was harvest time. The first ripe tomatoes came off the plant, and after all that waiting, I got to hold the result of this weird little idea in my hand. And I have to tell you, that moment was incredibly satisfying, because the transformation was complete. Burger tomato slice, to seed to seedling, to plant, to flower, to fruit, to harvest. That journey never stops being amazing when you say it out loud. This was no longer a theory, no longer a trick, no longer a cute experiment. This was food, real food, homegrown food. Tomatoes that existed because I took a chance on a ridiculous question and followed it all the way through. The container-grown plant also gave tomatoes, though clearly less impressive overall. It did enough to prove itself, but the difference between the two conditions was obvious. Ground growing gave bigger results, more stability, and better overall production. Still, both had one thing in common. They proved it could be done. And now came the final test: taste. Because let's be honest, growing a tomato from a McDonald's burger is fun, but if the fruit tastes bland, watery, or weird, then part of the excitement fades. So I cut into the harvested tomatoes and took a close look. Inside, they looked real, healthy, properly developed, not fake looking, not strange, just actual tomatoes. Then I tasted them. And this was the part I was most curious about. Would they taste cheap? Would they taste weak? Would they carry some strange off flavor? Or would they simply taste like a decent homegrown tomato? The answer surprised me. They were good. Not just good for a gimmick. Actually good. Mild, pleasant, easy to eat, with a sweetness that made them enjoyable. Now, were they the greatest tomato I've ever tasted in my life? No. But that's not really the point. The point is that they were absolutely respectable as a real harvest. And when you factor in the origin story, the result becomes even more impressive, because it means that something taken from a burger did not just survive long enough to prove a point. It became a genuinely productive, edible garden crop. That is incredible. One of the most interesting parts of the whole experiment was seeing variation between the two plants. Even though both came from the same source idea, they didn't perform identically. Their fruit shape, size, and behavior had differences. That makes sense. A lot of commercially used tomatoes are hybrids, and when you save seed from a hybrid, the offspring can vary. They may not grow exactly like the parent tomato the slice originally came from. Some traits can split, some characteristics can lean in different directions. And honestly, that unpredictability added another layer of fun.
But I'm not gonna know.
Because part of the magic here was not fully knowing what kind of tomato I would end up with. That uncertainty gave the whole project personality. It wasn't just growing a tomato, it was uncovering a mystery. Every stage answered one question and created another. Will it sprout? Yes. Will it survive? Yes. Will it flower? Yes. Will it fruit? Yes. What kind of fruit will it make? Let's see. Will it taste good? Try it and find out. That is the exact kind of journey that makes people stay invested. And that's also why gardening is so much more than production. Sure, production matters, yield matters, efficiency matters, but joy matters too. Wonder matters, curiosity matters, and some of the best things you can do in a garden are not the most practical things. Sometimes the best experiment is the one that gets you outside more often, the one that makes you check your plants with excitement, the one that gives you a reason to pay closer attention, the one that reminds you gardening is not just work, it's discovery. This experiment did exactly that. It made me more curious. It made me more observant. It made the garden feel even more alive. And maybe that is the real point of all this. Because yes, the headline is wild. Yes, it is fun to say I grew tomatoes from a McDonald's burger. Yes, it makes a great story. But underneath the novelty is a bigger truth. Life wants to grow. Give it a chance, and it often will. A seed does not care whether it came from a glamorous heirloom fruit on a farm stand or a tomato slice stuffed into a fast food sandwich. If that seed is mature and viable, and if you give it what it needs, it will try. That is inspiring in a weirdly simple way. There is something beautiful about the idea that hidden inside something so disposable was the power to create abundance. And maybe that is why this experiment feels so satisfying, because it turns consumption back into creation. It takes something we normally use thoughtlessly and makes us look at it differently. It reminds us that food is not just product. It is biology. It is continuity. It is potential, even in the most ordinary places. So, was it worth it? Absolutely. Not because this is the best way to start tomato plants every year. It isn't. If your goal is consistency, you're still better off choosing known varieties, quality seeds, or reliable starts. That is just common sense. But as an experiment, as a story, as proof of concept, as a reminder that gardening can still surprise you, this was 100% worth it. It worked. Not barely, not technically. It actually worked. And the fact that it worked this well is what makes it unforgettable. So if you've ever looked at something ordinary and wondered whether there was more hidden inside it, maybe this is your sign to try. Try the strange experiment. Try the goofy idea. Try the thing that makes you curious. Because even if it doesn't become your biggest harvest, it might become your favorite story. And sometimes that matters just as much. For me, this was a reminder that gardening should still feel alive. Not every plant has to be optimized. Not every project has to be serious. Not every success has to come from doing the standard thing the standard way. Sometimes you plant the weird seed. Sometimes you follow the ridiculous idea. Sometimes you grow the tomato from the burger just to see what happens. And every now and then, something amazing happens. A fast food tomato becomes a living plant. That plant becomes a heavy producer. That producer becomes a harvest. And that harvest becomes proof that life can show up in places we least expect. That's why I loved this experiment. Not just because it was fun, not just because it worked, but because it reminded me that the garden is still one of the few places where curiosity gets rewarded in the most real way possible. You ask a question, you test it, you wait, you learn. And eventually, if you stay with it long enough, you get an answer you can hold in your hands. That's powerful. And that is exactly why I think more people should do experiments like this. Not because they're efficient, not because they're necessary, but because they reconnect you with wonder. And in a world that moves way too fast, wonder is worth protecting. So yes, you really can plant a tomato from a McDonald's burger. Yes, it really can grow. Yes, it really can produce fruit. And yes, the result can be far more impressive than you'd expect. That tiny tomato slice had a whole future hidden inside it. All it needed was someone willing to find out. Alright everyone, Jackson here, and that's the video. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments what crazy gardening experiment I should try next. And tell me honestly, before this video, did you think a McDonald's burger tomato could actually turn into a productive tomato plant? Thank you so much for watching. I truly hope you enjoyed this experiment, got something meaningful out of it, and maybe even felt inspired to try something fun in your own garden. Take care, keep growing, and I'll see you in the next one.